December 8th, federal prosecutors in Texas unsealed documents that revealed an investigation into a massive smuggling network that stretched across the United States and around the world, dubbed Operation Gatekeeper by the feds. The investigation wasn't focused on drug smuggling or stolen goods, but rather an alleged secret underground network of suppliers for NVIDIA's graphic processing units, or GPUs.
November 2024. Chinese customs officials intercept a shipping container at Shenzhen port. Inside, they find 2,400 NVIDIA H100 chips disguised as automotive components. Street value, $72 million. But that's just one shipment. Over the next 3 weeks, authorities across Asia uncover a smuggling network that's moved an estimated $160 million worth of restricted NVIDIA chips into China since October 2023. And here's the part that should terrify the US government. These aren't low-end chips. These are H100s and A100s. The exact advanced AI accelerators that US export controls specifically banned from Chinese customers. The smuggling network that went undetected. The operation was sophisticated, not random individuals buying a few chips. This was organized criminal enterprise-level sophistication. The network operated across 6 countries: Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, UAE, South Korea. Each location served a specific purpose in the pipeline. Singapore handled procurement, Malaysia did repackaging, Vietnam provided shipping logistics, Thailand offered financial services for payment processing, UAE served as a transit hub. South Korea provided documentation fraud. Here's how it worked. Shell companies in Singapore purchased H100s from legitimate NVIDIA distributors. The purchases appeared normal. Tech startups, AI research firms, cloud service providers, all plausible end users. NVIDIA, and distributors had no reason to suspect anything. The chips shipped to Singapore addresses, but they never stayed there. Within 24 to 48 hours, the chips were moved to repackaging facilities in Malaysia. In Malaysia, workers removed NVIDIA packaging, stripped serial numbers, reboxed chips as automotive electronic control units or industrial computing equipment, created fake documentation showing the chips as dual-use commercial goods, not controlled AI accelerators, placed them in shipping containers with legitimate cargo as camouflage. The containers shipped to various Chinese ports: Shenzhen, Shanghai, Guangzhou. Most passed through customs without inspection. The few that got inspected showed paperwork for automotive electronics, not AI chips. Most inspectors didn't know what an H100 looked like anyway. Once in China, the chips went to various buyers: Alibaba, Tencent, ByteDance, smaller AI startups, research institutions. Some buyers knew the chips were smuggled. Others believed they were gray market imports that technically complied with regulations. The prices were premium. H100s selling for $50,000 to $60,000 each versus $30,000 to $40,000 in the US. But Chinese buyers had no alternatives. US export controls banned direct sales. Smuggled chips were the only way to get advanced NVIDIA hardware. Chinese customs estimates the network moved 4,000 to 5,000 chips over 13 months. At an average of $40,000 per chip, that's $160 to $200 million in total value. The operators made approximately 30 to 40% margin on each chip. Call it $50 to $60 million in profit, split among organizers, transporters, document forgers, customs officials taking bribes. A very lucrative criminal enterprise built on semiconductor smuggling. But the smuggling reveals a bigger problem. US export controls aren't working. The Biden administration imposed restrictions on advanced chip sales to China in October 2022, updated them in October 2023 with tighter rules. The goal was preventing China from accessing cutting-edge AI technology that could be used for military applications or surveillance. The restrictions specifically targeted chips like NVIDIA's A100 and H100, too powerful for civilian use, according to the US government. NVIDIA complied, stopped direct sales to Chinese customers, created downgraded versions like the A800 and H800 with reduced chip-to-chip bandwidth to meet export control thresholds. Those were legal to sell in China. But the US tightened controls again. Even the downgraded chips got banned eventually. By late 2023, NVIDIA couldn't legally sell any advanced AI accelerators to China. That created a black market. Chinese companies need AI compute. They're training large language models, building autonomous systems, developing computer vision applications. They can't just stop because the US banned chip sales, so they find other ways. Smuggling is the obvious answer. If there's demand and no legal supply, smugglers fill the gap. Economics 101. The US government knew this would happen. They knew export controls would drive smuggling, but they apparently believed enforcement would be effective enough. It wasn't. The smuggling network operated for over a year before authorities discovered it, moved thousands of chips, generated hundreds of millions in value, and this is just one network. Industry experts believe there are multiple smuggling operations. The 4,000 to 5,000 chips seized represent a fraction of total smuggled volume. James Lewis at the Center for Strategic and International Studies told Reuters, "Export controls only work if you can enforce them. Semiconductors are small, high value, easy to transport, perfect smuggling targets. Unless you're inspecting every single shipment, smugglers will get through." The US created demand for smuggling by banning chips China desperately wants, then failed to create enforcement mechanisms that could stop it. The Chinese domestic alternative that's advancing. But smuggling isn't China's long-term solution. They're developing domestic alternatives. Huawei's Ascend 910B, more threads MTTS 4000, SM site producing 7nm chips despite US equipment restrictions. China is investing over $150 billion in semiconductor self-sufficiency. The goal is eliminating dependency on US technology entirely. Huawei's Ascend 910B is the most advanced Chinese AI accelerator currently in production. It's not as powerful as NVIDIA's H100, roughly equivalent to A100 from 2020. But it's improving. Ascend 910C, planned for 2025, targets performance approaching H100. If Huawei achieves that, China becomes largely independent of US AI hardware. The technology gap is narrowing faster than many expected. Chinese tech giants are already using Ascend chips. Baidu deployed Ascend 910B clusters for their ERNIE LLM training. Tencent is testing Ascend for certain workloads. Alibaba has mixed deployments with both smuggled NVIDIA hardware and domestic Ascend chips. The Chinese AI industry is transitioning. Smuggled NVIDIA chips fill immediate needs. Domestic chips are the future. And here's what the US government doesn't seem to understand. Export controls accelerate Chinese domestic development. When China could buy NVIDIA chips legally, there was less urgency to develop alternatives. Why invest billions in domestic semiconductors when you can just buy the best chips from NVIDIA? But once the US banned sales, China had no choice. Invest or fall behind. They chose to invest massively. The export controls that were supposed to slow China's AI development are actually motivating faster domestic innovation. The NVIDIA revenue hole that can't be filled. For NVIDIA, the smuggling and Chinese domestic alternatives represent a massive revenue loss. China was 20 to 25% of NVIDIA's data center revenue before export controls. That's $10 to $15 billion annually. Gone. NVIDIA tried selling downgraded chips. The US banned those too. They proposed creating China-specific versions. The US rejected that. NVIDIA lobbied against the export controls. Lost that battle. Now they're completely locked out of the Chinese market. The smuggled chips don't help NVIDIA. They already sold those chips to distributors in Singapore or other countries. They got paid. But the smuggling happens in the secondary market. NVIDIA sees none of that revenue. And worse, smuggling enables Chinese companies to keep using NVIDIA architecture. Keep building on NVIDIA software. Keep training their engineers on NVIDIA tools. When export controls eventually lift, or when smuggling becomes more difficult, those Chinese companies won't necessarily come back to NVIDIA as customers. They'll have moved to Huawei Ascend or other domestic alternatives. NVIDIA loses the market permanently. Jensen Huang has been vocal about this in earnings calls. He warned that export controls would hurt NVIDIA without effectively slowing China. We've lost access to a major market. Our customers there are finding alternatives. Some are smuggling our chips, which we don't profit from. Others are developing their own solutions. Long-term, this doesn't help American interests or NVIDIA shareholders. Wall Street agrees. The enforcement challenge that has no solution. U.S. authorities are trying to stop the smuggling. They've assigned more resources to monitoring semiconductor exports, working with allied countries on enforcement, pressuring distributors to verify end users. But the challenge is enormous. There are thousands of chip distributors globally, millions of shipments monthly. You can't verify every end user. You can't inspect every container. Smugglers are sophisticated. They adapt faster than enforcement can. And there's limited international cooperation. Singapore, Malaysia, and UAE have incentives to look the other way. The chip distribution and repackaging business generates revenue and jobs. If they crack down too hard, the business moves to other countries. No government wants to lose economic activity for the sake of U.S. export controls they may not fully agree with anyway. The U.S. needs allied cooperation for enforcement. That cooperation is lukewarm at best. The U.S. government can sanction companies caught smuggling. They've done that. Added several entities to the restricted list. But for every company sanctioned, 3 more pop up. The smuggling networks are decentralized. If you shut down one operation, others fill the gap. It's whack-a-mole. The fundamental problem is demand. As long as Chinese companies desperately want NVIDIA chips and can't get them legally, smuggling will continue. The profit margins are too high. The enforcement risk is too low. The economics favor smuggling. What this means for the future. The NVIDIA smuggling story reveals multiple failures. Export controls that don't work. Enforcement that can't keep pace with smugglers. U.S. policy accelerating Chinese self-sufficiency. NVIDIA losing a major market permanently. And geopolitical technology decoupling that benefits no one. The entire strategy is backfiring. China will continue developing domestic semiconductors. In 5 years, they might achieve parity with U.S. technology. At that point, export controls become symbolic. They're already becoming symbolic as smuggling networks move chips despite restrictions. The U.S. government's leverage is declining. The window to use semiconductor access as geopolitical tool is closing. For NVIDIA, this is permanent revenue loss. The China market represented $10 to $15 billion annually. That's gone. It's not coming back. Even if export controls lift someday, Chinese companies will have moved to domestic alternatives. They won't return to NVIDIA after being forced to find other solutions. Jensen Huang knows this. NVIDIA's China revenue will never recover to pre-restriction levels. That's the cost of U.S. export control policy. The smuggling will continue until Chinese domestic chips are competitive enough that smuggling becomes unnecessary. That might be 2 to 3 years away. In the meantime, criminal networks profit. NVIDIA loses revenue. U.S. export controls fail to achieve their goals. And China accelerates towards semiconductor independence. Everyone loses except the smugglers. If this opened your eyes to what's really happening with semiconductor export controls, share it. Because mainstream media covers export controls as policy, not as the practical failure they're proving to be. The smuggling networks reveal the truth. You can't control technology through export restrictions when enforcement is impossible and demand is overwhelming. The U.S. strategy isn't working. China is adapting. NVIDIA is suffering. And the only winners are criminals moving chips across borders for massive profits. That's the real story of semiconductor geopolitics in 2025. Subscribe to see what happens when China achieves semiconductor self-sufficiency, because that's coming sooner than the US government expects. And when it arrives, American leverage disappears entirely. The technology competition enters a new phase, one where the US no longer controls the choke points, where China has domestic alternatives to everything, where export controls become irrelevant, We're heading toward that future faster than anyone predicted. The smuggling is just a symptom of a larger strategic failure that's still unfolding.